The ascension of the House of Stuart in 1603 marked the dawn of a new and certain age for England. For Elizabeth had ruled with stability for so long, and the vast majority of people had known no other monarch. Her reign, calm and steadfast, had painted a picture of order and control. Yet the changing tides religiously, economically, and politically left James I facing a daunting and unfamiliar reality. Challenges that would soon cast England into turmoil loomed large on the horizon. In this journey, we will witness England wrestle with civil war and revolution, all while building the very foundations of what would become its sprawling global empire. The rise of Parliament must begin with Parliament, for it had been growing in power for centuries. From its early days of clashing with the Crown over taxes for the 100 Years' War, it had transformed into an essential part of governance. The Tudors had leaned heavily on Parliament to support monumental decisions, such as Henry VIII's break with Rome and Elizabeth's sweeping religious reforms, though her increasingly Puritan Parliament she had ventured even further into Protestantism. The ascension of the Stuarts, however, would present Parliament with an opportunity to assert its authority even further. James I, with few loyalists to rely on within Parliament, quickly found himself at odds with the institution. Parliament had become increasingly Puritan in its composition, a sharp contrast to the more moderate James. The unity they briefly shared in the wake of the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, when a group of Catholic conspirators, led by Guy Fawkes, plotted to blow up Parliament while the king was present, did not last long. James' extravagant spending created the need for money Parliament was unwilling to grant. In his desperation, James bypassed Parliament by raising customs duties, imposing forced loans, and granting monopolies to select individuals and companies. Parliament, deeming these actions illegal, rose in protest. By 1610 and again in 1614, James dissolved Parliament to silence their opposition. But Parliament would not be so easily cowed. In 1624, Parliament passed the Act of Monopolies, stripping the king of his power to bestow monopolies as he pleased. This moment marked the first time Parliament had directly legislated away a royal prerogative, and it would not be the last. However, it was under James' son, Charles I, that the tension with Parliament would reach a boiling point, consuming the country in a conflict that would echo throughout history. Much like his father, Charles was frustrated by Parliament's reluctance to grant him funds. Although the Crown retained power over matters of war and peace, Charles' decision to wage war against both France and Spain simultaneously did not sit well with Parliament. They resisted his attempts to raise taxes to fund the wars. In retaliation, Charles resorted to forced loans, coercing wealthy men, many of them members of Parliament, to give him money or face imprisonment. Countless powerful men found themselves treated as criminals. Charles' imposition of martial law in the South and his seizure of private homes to house his troops only deepened his anger with the common people. In 1628, Parliament responded with the Petition of Right, which declared that no tax, loan, or gift could be imposed without Parliament's approval, that no person should be imprisoned without knowledge of the charges against them, that soldiers should not be billeted in people's homes without consent, and that martial law should not be declared. This petition was a monumental step in political thought, establishing fundamental principles of English freedom, a freedom from arbitrary government power that could trample the rights of its citizens. But even this did not deter Charles. In the following year, he dissolved Parliament, choosing instead to rule by royal prerogative for the next 11 years. His reign became that of an absolutist monarch, where his arbitrary actions, including the raising of customs duties, the reinstitution of medieval forest laws, and the imposition of a nationwide ship tax, transformed Charles into a king who directly challenged the rule of law. The Civil War Parliament was not summoned again until 1640, when Charles found himself needing funds to quell a rebellion in Scotland. But this time, Parliament was out for blood. They forced Charles to agree to meet Parliament at least once every 3 years and began impeachment proceedings against several of his ministers, most notably Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, who was tried and executed for his abuses of power in Ireland. Charles reluctantly signed the death warrant, a decision that would haunt him. Religious differences, too, fueled the conflict. Charles, an Arminian, favored the grandeur and ceremony of the Church of England and supported the continued existence of bishops. Parliament, largely Puritan, saw this as a betrayal and viewed Charles as no better than a Catholic. In 1641, Ireland erupted in rebellion, and Charles and Parliament both sought control of the militia raised to suppress it. Each feared the other would use it to secure their power. Parliament declared its control of the militia, but Charles, feeling the pressure, marched into Parliament with armed men to demand the arrest of 5 leading MPs. When they had already fled, Parliament refused to comply. This brazen act of royal power marked a point of no return. There was no path forward but war. Charles fled to York, where he began raising his own army. Parliament, too, formalized its control over the militia and began calling up troops. The English Civil War was upon them. The Royalists, loyal to the king, and the Parliamentarians, determined to resist him, clashed. The North and West, along with Wales, rallied to the king, while the South and East sided with Parliament. At first, Charles seemed to have the upper hand, winning the first major battle at Edgehill in October 1642. Yet, he failed to press his advantage onto London. Despite victories in Bristol, Newbury, and other locations, the tide turned in 1644 with the arrival of Scottish reinforcements for Parliament. The Royalists were dealt a crushing blow at the Battle of Marston Moor. But it was the Battle of Naseby in 1645 that sealed the Royalists' fate. Their army was destroyed, and the momentum swung irreversibly in Parliament's favor. By 1646, Charles' forces were in retreat. The Royalist headquarters at Oxford fell, and Charles fled north, eventually surrendering to the Scots, who handed him over to Parliament. By the time the fighting ceased, over 300,000 lives had been lost. Although the capture of Charles I ended the First Civil War, Parliament's troubles were far from over. The rising power of the army, led by Oliver Cromwell, worried the governing body. Cromwell's forces had become even more fervently Puritan than Parliament itself, and had gained immense power throughout the war. Despite Charles remaining under house arrest for almost 2 years, Parliament was uncertain of what to do with him. In 1648, a fresh wave of royalist uprisings forced Cromwell to act. He crushed them swiftly, but his actions solidified his belief that Charles' very existence posed a threat to the new order Parliament sought to establish. In December of that year, Cromwell and his allies seized control of Parliament, expelled the moderates, and brought Charles to trial for treason. The charges against him were flimsy, yet the verdict was clear. Charles I was condemned to death on January 26, 1649, and 4 days later, the King of England was executed on a scaffold outside Surmise Palace. The Commonwealth. With Charles' death, England was declared a Commonwealth. Parliament, now the sole authority, struggled to govern in his absence. Cromwell, now at the helm, spent the next few years suppressing remaining royalists, particularly in Ireland. His brutal actions against the Irish Catholics, massacring civilians and seizing land, were widely condemned. Meanwhile, he marched against the Protestant Scots in 1650, after they declared Charles II as king. Cromwell's power, built upon his military successes and support from the army, made him virtually untouchable. In 1653, frustrated by Parliament's inefficiency, Cromwell dissolved it and declared himself Lord Protector. His reign, though one of military strength, was also one of puritanical reform. He imposed moral laws across the country, banning gambling, fining those who broke the Sabbath, and punishing those deemed immoral. His regime became a strict military dictatorship, though one that still posed challenges for the ordinary people of England. By the time Cromwell died in 1658, his rule had become so oppressive that even the staunchest parliamentarians began to yearn for the monarchy. Cromwell's son, Richard, was quickly sidelined, and Parliament, in a surprising turn, invited the exiled Charles II back to the throne in 1660. The restoration was a triumphant return for Charles II, but the monarchy, and England itself, would never be the same again. Colonization and the Americas. Amidst the political upheaval that gripped England, the nation's ambitions abroad continued to expand with an unyielding drive. The rise of what would become the First British Empire marked the beginning of an era of overseas conquest, trade, and settlement. England's pursuit of territorial growth and economic gain knew no bounds. English settlers, fueled by a desire for new opportunities, a thirst for religious freedom, and the prospect of wealth, began to establish colonies far from their homeland, marking the birth of an empire that would stretch across continents. In Ireland, the English and Scottish colonization of Ulster began in earnest during the reign of James I, and continued under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. The Crown initiated the process of land confiscation from native Irish communities to give way to settlers from England and Scotland. This marked the beginning of a profound and painful chapter for the Irish people as Cromwell intensified this effort through the violent redistribution of Irish land. The English military, driven by both religious and political motives, violently subdued Ireland, and thousands of Irish families were forcibly displaced to make way for a new wave of colonists. The Irish experience would remain an enduring example of England's growing imperial reach and the lengths it was willing to go to in order to expand its power. Meanwhile, across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, a new world was beginning to take shape. In 1607, the English established their first lasting colony in Virginia, in the New World. The settlement, founded by the Virginia Company, would become a symbol of England's expansionist desires. However, it was far from an easy success. The early years of Virginia's settlement were marked by hardships, famine, disease, and conflict with the indigenous peoples. Yet, through determination and sheer will, the colony began to find its footing, particularly with the cultivation of tobacco, a crop that would soon revolutionize the colony's economy. The wealth brought to England through the tobacco trade was a key factor in securing the colony's future and solidifying England's presence in the Americas. Just over a decade later, in 1620, a group of Puritans, dissatisfied with the religious climate in England, made their way across the Atlantic aboard the Mayflower. Landing at Plymouth Rock, they founded a colony with a radically different mission: to escape religious persecution and create a new society based on their interpretation of Christian values. The Pilgrims, as they came to be known, forged an enduring legacy as pioneers in the struggle for religious freedom, paving the way for future settlers who sought not just wealth, but a life free from the constraints of the English crown. Their arrival marked the beginning of a new wave of English settlers, many of whom saw the New World as a place to build new lives and communities where they could thrive without interference from our monarchs. The colonies, though not without their difficulties and obstacles, began to grow in size and influence. By the time the English Civil War erupted in the 1640s, more than 50,000 English settlers had moved to the Americas, each with dreams of a new life. Many came seeking fortune, while others sought to escape religious conflict, and still more were driven by the promise of land in a rapidly expanding world. In addition to the thriving tobacco plantations of Virginia, English settlements also flourished in places like Maryland, New England, and the Carolinas. The colony's economies became increasingly tied to agricultural production, particularly the cultivation of tobacco, cotton, and rice. These crops, often harvested by enslaved Africans, became the backbone of the New World economy, feeding England's insatiable need for raw materials. Though these early colonies were largely self-governing, left to develop independently, and largely free from the oversight of the Crown, tensions were already rising between England and its distant colonies. While England's attention was focused inward on the political and religious unrest at home, the colonies grew in influence and power. Over time, they would come to play a critical role in shaping the history of England itself. The colonies, once far-flung and loosely governed, would soon become key players in the future conflict between England and its American subjects. This conflict, which would define the next century, would lead to the American Revolution and the eventual establishment of the United States, a transformation that would forever alter the course of history. What started as a handful of colonies struggling to survive in a hostile land had slowly become an empire in its own right. The English colonies in the Americas were no longer mere extensions of England. They were emerging nations with their own distinct identities, economies, and dreams of independence. And while England might have been preoccupied with internal strife, the colonies began to chart their own path towards self-determination. What had once seemed like a distant and uncertain experiment was now a thriving testament to England's ability to shape the world on its own terms. As England's focus remained on its struggles at home, the colonies continued to develop, nurturing a sense of autonomy that would soon challenge the very fabric of the empire. The story of England's expansion into the Americas had only just begun, and its long-lasting impact would echo through the centuries to come, leaving a legacy that would shape the future of the entire world. The English in Africa and Asia's England grappled with its internal struggles, its ambitions on the global stage expanded. Africa and Asia, rich in resources and strategic importance, became focal points for England's imperial aspiration. The English, having secured a foothold in the Americas, now sought to stretch their influence across vast new territories. One of the most significant and morally complex chapters in England's imperial history emerged with the transatlantic slave trade. England, alongside other European powers, became deeply entrenched in this devastating practice, sending ships across the Atlantic to bring enslaved Africans to the colonies. But beyond the slave trade, England's engagement in Africa and Asia was driven by a thirst for wealth, power, and access to new markets. In Africa, the English established coastal trading posts to trade goods such as gold, ivory, and slaves. They quickly learned to navigate the political complexities of Africa's diverse kingdoms, forging alliances with local leaders, often exploiting divisions for their own benefit. The English established a vast network of trading posts along the West African coast, and the riches from this trade began to flow back into England, fueling the rise of its empire. In Asia, the pursuit of wealth and control took on a different form. The East India Company, a powerful British corporation, played a critical role in the expansion of England's influence in the subcontinent. The Mule Empire, one of the most powerful and prosperous empires in the world at the time, was a key trading partner for England. The Mule Emperor granted the East India Company the privilege to establish trade posts, and through these posts, the English gradually gained a foothold in India. The East India Company was not merely a commercial entity, it became a political force in its own right, and over time, it began to exert control over vast swaths of India. In the 18th century, England's presence in India solidified, and by the middle of the century, England's Indian Empire had become a reality. The British, through a combination of military force, diplomacy, and shrewd economic management, began to dominate India's political landscape. The wealth generated from the lucrative spice, textile, and opium trades flowed into England's coffers, bolstering its commercial dominance. India became an essential part of the British Empire, and its resources would play a pivotal role in fueling England's rise to global prominence. The exploitation of both Africa and Asia through trade and colonization laid the foundations for England's future as the world's leading imperial power. But as England's empire expanded, so too did the moral and ethical dilemmas surrounding these practices. The brutality of the slave trade and the exploitation of native peoples would leave an indelible stain on England's legacy, one that would come to haunt the empire as it expanded further across the globe. A New England as the 17th century gave way to the 18th. England was undergoing a transformation. The political landscape had shifted dramatically. The monarchy, once absolute, had been constrained by the power of Parliament, which had steadily grown in strength. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 had firmly established Parliament's supremacy over the Crown, signaling a profound change in England's political system. The monarchy was no longer all-powerful, and its authority had been tempered by the increasing power of the people's representatives in Parliament. At the same time, England was experiencing a series of revolutions, scientific, agricultural, and financial, that would forever alter the course of its history. The English Scientific Revolution, spearheaded by figures such as Isaac Newton and William Harvey, challenged the long-held assumptions of the ancient world and set the stage for modern science. Newton's laws of motion and gravity, alongside Harvey's groundbreaking work on blood circulation, revolutionized not only science but also England's view of the natural world. The agricultural revolution, too, was reshaping England. The introduction of new farming techniques, such as crop rotation and the use of fertilizers, led to an increase in agricultural productivity. New machinery, like the seed drill, helped farmers work more efficiently, while the enclosure movement, the privatization of common lands, allowed for more intensive farming. By the early 18th century, England's agricultural output was 5 times what it had been in the 14th century, and the nation began to experience a new prosperity. The financial revolution was equally transformative. England embraced a new capitalist mindset, with the creation of joint stock companies and the establishment of the Bank of England in 1694. These financial institutions provided the capital necessary to fund the expansion of trade and industry. England's growing wealth was matched by its increasing influence in world affairs. By the early 18th century, England had become the leading commercial power of the world, its navy unmatched, and its colonies flourishing. A new England had emerged, one that was increasingly defined by freedom, liberty, and a growing sense of global dominance. The people of England, now more politically empowered and economically prosperous, saw themselves as the leaders of the world. The foundations of the British Empire were set, and England's future seemed limitless. But this new England was not without its challenges. As the empire expanded, so did the tensions between the crown and parliament, and between the interests of the aristocracy and the burgeoning middle class. The conflicts that had defined the 17th century were far from over, but England's transformation was undeniable. The Glorious Revolution in 1685, England's political system faced another test. The death of Charles II left the throne to his Catholic brother, James II. James' ascension was met with alarm by many in England. His Catholic faith, at a time when Protestantism was firmly entrenched in England, was seen as a direct threat to the Protestant establishment. Parliament, fearing the re-establishment of Catholicism in England, took swift action. In 1688, Parliament secretly invited William of Orange, the Protestant ruler of the Netherlands, and his wife, Mary, the daughter of James II, to come to England and seize the throne. William, eager to involve England in the war against France, agreed. He landed in southern England with an army, and James, unable to rally support, fled the country. There was no battle, no bloodshed. The Glorious Revolution had succeeded without a shot being fired. This peaceful transfer of power marked the end of Catholic rule in England and the beginning of a new era. William and Mary's reign ushered in an era of parliamentary supremacy. Parliament, now firmly in control, passed the Bill of Rights in 1689, which outlined the rights of Parliament and the limits of the monarchy. It was a monumental moment in English history, as it established the principle that the king or queen could not rule without the consent of Parliament. The Glorious Revolution was a testament to the strength of England's institutions and the wisdom of its people. It demonstrated that England had reached a point where political conflict could be resolved without violence. A stark contrast to the civil wars and religious strife that had plagued the country in the previous century. The success of the Glorious Revolution solidified the power of Parliament and set the stage for England's future as a constitutional monarchy, where the king or queen would serve as a figurehead, and the real power would rest with the elected representatives of the people. This peaceful revolution marked a turning point in England's history. It signaled the end of absolutism and the rise of a government accountable to the people. The Glorious Revolution was not just a victory for Parliament, but for the people of England, who had fought for their rights and freedoms. It was a new dawn for England, one that would lay the groundwork for the empire that would rise to dominate the world.